All right, so let's start with the week 5 lecture. I actually got 10 minutes into recording this already, and then my laptop decided that it was going to restart to install some things without even asking me. So hopefully I remember everything that I wanted to say and say it again. Okay, so we're now moving into some more concrete, more applied issues this week. So previously we've been talking about, these metaphysical arguments for the existence of God, radical skepticism, whether or not science progresses, and that last one at least is a little bit sort of closer to the ground, closer to our daily life, as it were. But still, it was all rather abstract in the way it was argued for, at least. This week, we're going to do something which is, in one sense, probably more comfortable for everyone because it's less abstract. It's something which you may have more opinions about, you may have thought about before. In another sense, it will be less comfortable because it covers some, let's say, sensitive topics, right? So in the two articles which I'll be covering in the lecture, we are going over like the moral status of human lives, and in particular the status of abortion. And then, of course, in the article for the reading sequence, you'll be going over an ethical argument for vegetarianism, the conclusion of which will be that it is morally incorrect to eat meat. And these are things about which you may have strong feelings and opinions. That being the case, do make sure that, especially in the discussion section, you try not to let it get too heated. Obviously, you should register your disagreement with the people in your group where it exists, but do so in a civil fashion. When you're writing your submissions to me for the active reading assignment for the summary, obviously I want you to be rational and logical when you're evaluating these arguments and putting forward your own opinions. But don't worry too much about about offending me or anything like that. Write your argument, write your opinions about this as you see fit in those, and then I will let you know whether I think you've strayed off into sort of non-logical, non-rational argumentation. So do recall that for the reading sequence, that is the active reading, the group discussion, and the individual summary, you only are addressing the ethical vegetarianism argument, right? So you aren't addressing the other two arguments, which I will cover in the lecture. So let's go ahead and get to the presentation. So before we get into the two arguments, I want to just say a couple words about ethical theories. So ethical theories there's a whole bunch of them in philosophical discourse, and they are very different from each other in what they emphasize, which concepts they think are most important for discussing moral issues. One very basic distinction to keep in mind is that there are kind of two parts to an ethical theory. The first part tells you which things have moral value. The second part tells you what to do with that information. So when you're figuring out what a sort of disagreement you may have with another person is, or you're trying to figure out your own ethical thoughts, you need to pull these two things apart from each other. So one, you need to figure out what you or someone else assigns moral value to. And this is called, not surprisingly, value theory, or its more fancy philosophical name, axiology. And the question addressed here is simply which objects, qualities, or states of affairs have moral value. So this is asking the question, which things are good and which things are bad, right? And when you're talking about this, so for instance, there is a well-worn ethical value theory called hedonism, and hedonism is a value theory. It says, here's the good thing. It's the only good thing, happiness. Here is the bad thing. It's the only bad thing, unhappiness. Anything else say autonomy, say health, say, friendships, those things don't have any value by themselves. They are not, a friendship or a relationship, your health, that's not good all by itself. It's good only if it leads to happiness. If it doesn't lead to happiness, then it's no good. That's the hedonist value theory, right? So you, of course, could have a different value theory in which you assigned a value to, health, and it didn't really matter if you were happy as long as you were healthy. That was, what was morally good, and of course, being unhealthy would be morally bad. You could assign moral value to anything, really. Usually, things like happiness, autonomy, health, those are the kinds of things that you tend to see in value theories, or just more broadly, preference, satisfaction, which is a little bit more abstract. But that's what a value theory deals with. On the other hand, normative ethics is telling you it's not about good or bad. It's not about which things have value. It's about right or wrong. It's about which actions you should choose. Now, of course, it's fairly intuitive to think that which actions you should choose has something to do with what things are good or bad. And here's how that might fit together. So we're on the last 2 bullet points here of this slide. You might think that obedience is what has value, right? So you can imagine some totalitarian dictator state in which, the good thing was to be obedient, right? Now, if you think that that's true, then the fact that an action leads to unhappiness is irrelevant to you. All you care about is obedience. If you're happy and that leads you to be more obedient, well then happiness is instrumentally valuable. But the only thing which has real moral value, according to this, would be obedience. If that was your value theory, a strange value theory though it is, you would then think that the right actions somehow foster obedience, that is, create more of it. And that second part would be the normative aspect of your ethical theory. The first part, what you think has moral value, would be the value theory, the axiological part. On the other hand, something that's a bit more intuitive, if you think that happiness is what has value, like the hedonist, then the fact that something is disobedient you don't care about, right? The only reason to care about disobedience would be if it leads to unhappiness or happiness. As long as it doesn't, it has no value to you. So under this value theory, like the hedonist, you would think that it is good, you think that it's right to foster happiness. Now notice that the normative part of these 2 theories, although the theories would have grossly different consequences as to what you do, the normative part is actually the same. It says, whatever the good thing is, make more of that. That's what the normative component says. Therefore, they differ. The only way to explain the difference in what these 2 theories tell you to do is to look at what they think the good thing is. And of course, this first theory thinks the good thing is obedience. The second theory thinks the good thing is happiness. And so that explains the difference between them. If you only looked at what actions they suggested, you'd be kind of perplexed. They both say, you have to maximize obedience. The other one says, you have to maximize happiness. If you didn't sort of dig down a little bit, although it doesn't take much work to figure this out, and figure out what they valued, what they thought the good thing was, you might be you couldn't explain what the difference between them was. So hopefully that makes something clear to you, equips you to understand different people's ethical systems a little bit better. I teach this sort of stuff to my ethics class in a bit more detail when I teach ethics, because this idea of looking for the normative part and the axiological part of different theories gives you a good way to differentiate between them. We won't get too much more into that because this isn't an ethics class, it's a more general introduction class, but I thought this would be helpful to talk about as we moved into some ethical issues. And we will look at a number of ethical topics throughout the course. I think most of the topics end up being ethical. But now let's get into the first argument. So our first argument is about the moral status of animals from marginal cases. And you can find this in chapter 69 of the textbook on page 263. You'll notice that I think all three of the articles that you have to read for this week mention Peter Singer in the sort of sources for the article. Peter Singer, unlike I think all the other philosophers we've looked at so far, is alive still, right? So he's not some old dead guy. He is alive. He's in his 60s. He's Australian, and he's very prominent in the sort of philosophical ethics scene, and he's, I guess, even a popular intellectual as well. He's written stuff, op-ed pieces for the New York Times, so he doesn't just write academic books for academic audiences. He's very engaged in the public sphere. So his name crops up a lot because he is one of the first proponents of sort of animal ethics, I guess you'd call it. All right, so let's go through this argument. P1. If there is no morally relevant difference between marginal humans and some non-animals, then if marginal humans have moral status, so do some non-human animals. Premise 2. There is no morally relevant difference between marginal humans and some non-human animals. Conclusion 1. If marginal humans have status, then do some non-human animals. So what you'll notice, I'm going to interject something here. You'll notice that we have another modus ponens, right? That if P then Q, P therefore Q. This one is actually nested. Right? There is an if-then, and within that if-then, there's another one, right? If there is no blah, 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 then if marginal humans have moral status, and it doesn't have the then there, then so do some non-human animals as well. So we have an if P then Q. That's what it looks like, right? That's what the P1 there is. And then we have the first P. So we have if P then Q. We get the first P, so we get to conclude if P then Q. So we have another modus ponens going on here. And you can see where this is going to go. We're going to get that first P again, and then we're going to be able to conclude Q. And so, indeed, premise 3 says marginal humans have moral status, right? So that's the P here. Conclusion, some non-human animals have moral status. Is that all the premises of this? Yeah. Okay, so this is a shorter argument, and it's fairly straightforward. Now, obviously, the key phrase here is this key idea is the idea of marginal humans. So we need to figure out what that means. And when you figure out what that means, we have to be careful, right? What we don't want to do is pick an answer which is what I'll call theoretically motivated. We want it to be independently motivated. What's the difference between these two? Well, when someone does something that's theoretically motivated, when they give you an answer that's theoretically motivated, they're giving you an answer in order to win the argument, basically. They're trying to figure out what they have to say in order to make their argument correct. On the other hand, an independently motivated argument or independently motivated consideration is one which is independent of the argument, which would be true and plausible outside of this particular argumented context. So, and I sort of say that here, to be theoretically motivated is to say you can't pick an answer in order to make it such that all and only humans count. So if you want to figure out what makes, what defines sort of a human for moral purposes, you're probably not going to want to pick a particular genetic makeup or evolutionary ancestry. Or at least that might be what makes them human, but that's not what makes them morally relevant. So the usual answers that we find here are things which, in fact, not every existing human being is currently capable of. That was a lot of qualifiers, right? So when we're trying to figure out what a marginal human is, we're trying to figure out what a regular human is also. So what does something have to have in order to count as human? You might think, oh, higher reasoning or the ability to speak. Now, not all things which are genetically human have those two, right? So here the idea is that we need to have a consistent criteria of what creates moral status. And we have to come up with this in such a way that it's sort of independently plausible and not in a way that just happens to make it so that all humans have moral status and nothing else has moral status, right? And then, what counts as marginal will be determined by how close they are to these criteria. So we said in this previous slide, higher reasoning or speech. Well, a person with a brain injury, some kind of significant brain injury, or a person with some sort of congenital brain deformity may not be able to perform higher reasoning tasks, understand or produce language, either at all ever because they have some congenital deformity, or anymore because they were injured. Do we want to say that they therefore are no longer have moral status? If you say no, well then you have to figure out a way to extend moral status to them. Now you might do it by saying, well look, they have moral status because they can enjoy or suffer things, because they're capable of feeling pain, basically. Now, of course, if you take that move, then, well, plenty of animals can feel pain. Plenty of animals can enjoy and suffer things, right? Anyone who has, like, a dog or a cat has seen them enjoy stuff, right? Playing with their favorite toy, getting a belly rub, eating, whatever. They obviously enjoy that, and you've seen them capable of feeling some sort of pain as well, like when you've accidentally stepped on their tail or something like that. So if we want to extend moral status to these marginal humans who have some sort of brain injury or congenital defect, then to be consistent, we are also going to have to extend that moral status to non-human animals. So going back here, the idea is that when we stipulate that moral status has to do with feeling pain, we're saying that that's what's morally relevant. So the fact that humans stand on 2 legs and dogs on 4, that's a difference between animals, between dogs in particular and humans, but it's not a morally relevant difference because 4 legs versus 2 legs has nothing to do with whether or not you can feel pain, right? So that's what I'm saying. We have to be consistent. Now, of course, you could bite the bullet. Now, when I say bite the bullet, this is a sort of phrase in philosophy and in academic jargon more generally, which means that someone presents you with a sort of negative, counterintuitive seeming consequence, and you just accept it. You're like, I recognize that that's weird, but I don't care. I'm not going to change my theory because of this consequence. So in this case, biting the bullet would be to say, oh, this genetically human being, this thing which looks like a human being, isn't capable of higher thought or understanding and producing language. You say, nope, they don't have moral status. Oh well, too bad for them, right? So that's logically consistent, right? So being consistent, you can always do 2 things. If you say P, and then someone presents you this sort of objection, you can either abandon your original claim, or you can stick with your original claim and try and explain away this objection. Those are both consistent things to do. So consistency has nothing to do with being intuitive or plausible. It has to do with not contradicting yourself, right? So person biting the bullet here would say, nope, they lack moral status if they can't perform higher reasoning tasks. Now, obviously, that's not going to make you very popular, right? because very small children can't perform higher reasoning tasks or produce language. People who are in comas or who've had severe injury, sure, they used to be able to do that thing, but now they can't anymore. Likewise, some people when they are old, they have these degenerative mental issues that cause them to not be able to have higher reasoning functions anymore, or at least not to the same capacity that they used to. If you're biting the bullet here, you're saying none of those people have moral value. And of course, if you say that kind of thing, well, people aren't going to like you very much. The person biting the bullet could say something like, look, moral status is tied to having some particular supernatural essence, which, as it so happens, all humans and only humans have, right? So something like, humans have a soul, and all humans have a soul as long as they're alive and kicking, but no animals have that. So that might be true. It's very likely if someone says something like that, it's very difficult not to see that as theoretically motivated. Now, of course, it could be independently motivated if they've already laid out this kind of supernaturalist religious picture, then it's perfectly consistent for them to do so, although it doesn't seem very plausible, right? Because now they have to prove that people have souls, and only people have souls, and, well, no one's been able to do that kind of thing in any convincing fashion so far. So that is a perfectly acceptable maneuver, logically speaking, but in other respects, it's not very convincing. And so when in your thesis articulation feedback, I gave you this statement about not tying your thesis to particular religious or cultural worldviews, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm not saying that it's logically problematic. I'm just saying that you are drastically reducing the scope of your argument, and you are, in fact, creating more work for yourself, because now you have to prove that this particular religious or cultural worldview is the correct one. And generally, you want to make your arguments have as few commitments to controversial claims as possible. Your argument itself can be controversial, but you don't want its success to be tied up with other controversial stuff, because that just means it's harder for you to succeed, basically. So as I say, this supernaturalist, perhaps religious picture is very narrow. It requires buying a specific metaphysical or spiritual picture, and some such pictures do stipulate that non-human animals have essences after all, so it's not just this very vague spiritualist picture that's going to work. It's got to be a very, very particular one. And again, that narrows the scope of your argument extremely. So we're going to end that first one right there, and then in the next part we'll talk about this TOOLEY'S argument on the right to life. I've renamed that one a little bit, and I'll explain why when we get to it.